So we're going to talk about censorship. So let's start off with what censorship is and what we're talking about when we're talking about censorship. So a lot of you are probably thinking of the Great Wall of China or the Great Firewall of China, sorry, or other massive censorship efforts. But what we're going to focus on here is actually more subtle censorship efforts. And what censorship really comes down to, as far as the definition goes, is an attempt to suppress or regulate access to content. Okay? So to suppress or regulate public access to content, that's a key word there, public access. This isn't really about private communications between one another. This is really about public communications. So there's two types of censorship that I want to talk about. The first is direct. So direct censorship really comes down to government control and basically straight up saying, no, you can't say those things, right? So this is the kind of censorship we traditionally think of when we're talking about censorship. This includes things like the Great Firewall of China, right? And it also is about things such as the more subtle Australian firewall that restricts communications within its borders. So it's about so much more than, what we usually think of as being problematic with censorship, right? We initially think of censorship as a way to reduce political speech, to curb resistance from people who don't support their local governments or their national governments. But if we look at the difference between like the Great Firewall of China and the Firewall of Australia, you're going to notice some differences. So in China, a lot of the internet communications are controlled in such a way that you can't say anything directly negative toward the government or about the government. But Australia is not really concerned with that. They're more concerned with restricting access to certain types of content from or to its citizens. A good example of this is that they have a lot of filters based off of what they consider to be harmful content. And sometimes you'll find that good sites or good information ends up being blocked within those as well. And that's one of the issues with regards to censorship and whether or not it's something that can be beneficial. Sometimes we do want to censor information directly, such as porn to children. That's obviously not something people generally think is good for children to see or visit in that context. But at the same time, how do we restrict access or censor things appropriately for age or other factors that we might find to be important? Now, the other type of censorship that we are going to talk about a little bit is self-censorship. So self-censorship is that really subtle form of censorship where I don't say something because I want to stay in somebody's good graces. So I don't say negative things in order to stay in good graces with either a government official, with a business, or with powerful individuals. And this doesn't even necessarily need to be a powerful individual. It could be a powerful group. So, for example, I might not say something negative about Tennessee Tech because I might want to avoid getting fired or avoid negative consequences for my actions or for my thoughts. That's considered self-censorship. And the internet plays an important role in this type of censorship as well. For example, if I'm using Twitter, very frequently your actual name is tied to your Twitter account, right? You'll frequently see people using their real names on Twitter instead of being anonymous. Same thing with Facebook and Instagram and other, social networking sites. If I put my real name onto these services and they then say something that's potentially damaging to either a group or an individual, then I may choose not to say those things in order to avoid potential harm. Uh, it's important to understand that this kind of censorship isn't something we really can uh, protect against very easily because it really comes down to avoiding damage from power. And sometimes this is mutually beneficial. So a news organization might avoid publishing a negative story about a political figure if they're given money to not publish it. Uh, I mean, if the news organization can have guaranteed cash flow and the political person can avoid having something negative said about them in the press, this might be something that they both see as beneficial for their particular situation. Now, that doesn't necessarily make it ethical or right, but it could be mutually beneficial. Now, some other things that make dealing with the internet challenging is not just things like censorship. Although censorship is the big one people often talk about, we also can talk about how many-to-many communications cause issues, and this can be related to censorship. How do you censor when so many people can talk to so many other people without really having a liaison or a go-between in order to have that communication filtered? There's also the dynamicness of the internet. So there's always new content popping up. There's always new connections being made, always new servers being connected. It's really hard to really cut down on who has access. The other aspect here is that it is large or huge. So because people can connect whenever, however, and it's frequently happening more and more that more devices are connected, whether it's smartphones or IoT devices or servers, it's becoming a huge network of machines. And it's really, really hard to deal with negative consequences from this technology when we, again, have so many people, so many machines connected, so much dynamic content, so many different people being able to communicate to so many other people. It's hard to filter that content, to censor it, or to protect against clearly criminal activity. And the last area that really makes this difficult is that it's global. Network communication isn't something that's just in the US or just in some other country. It's not localized in any way. So it's really hard to decide what's right or wrong because every country has a different idea of what's right. Obviously, Australia and China as government entities think that what they're doing with their censorship is correct, otherwise they wouldn't be doing it. But we don't do the same kind of censorship here in the US. And that doesn't necessarily mean we're better, but it does mean that we don't agree on a particular aspect of how the internet works. Now, in addition to that, we have the freedom of expression, and people will say this makes it difficult to interact as well. So this is our First Amendment right here in the US. And it's not like we're the only place that has this freedom of expression, but we will be talking about it in the context of the US First Amendment just because that is something that we're mostly familiar with. Now, if you're an international student or maybe you didn't go to high school here in the US, this might be something you're not quite as familiar with, but that's okay. The full wording of the amendment is in your book, and the idea behind it is really that you have the right to say whatever you want. Now, the purpose behind the Freedom of Expression Amendment is really that you have the right to say whatever you want about politics and about this political interaction that you have with your speech and with how that impacts government. And it's important to remember that it is not an absolute right and that it does have some restrictions. For example, you can't libel or slander. All right. Hold on 1 second. So you can't libel or slander which basically means you can't lie about another person without consequence. You can't have reckless or calculated lies, which kind of goes in the same category of things. It also includes things such as you can't falsely advertise, you can't misrepresent yourself, you have to be honest about who you are. So you don't really get protections from doing these kind of things. You're not just able to get away with whatever kind of communication you want. Another example is you can't yell fire in a crowded theater when there's no fire. Like you have to, that would fall under that reckless and calculated lies category of things. But the idea here is that it has to be balanced with the public good. And we need to decide what the public good is in the context of network communications. Does that mean that we're not ever allowed to do something that's potentially harmful? How do we determine what's potentially harmful? Does that mean that we have to filter down content so that it's only acceptable? How do we monitor traffic? How do we do all these other things while protecting the freedom of expression and its intent, but not allowing people to get away with doing whatever they want? Right? Remember that the internet doesn't really care about our social conventions. So when we say libel and slander in in the US, we usually talk about that in terms of the press or in terms of in-person communications. On the internet, it's a lot easier to get away with these things because you're either anonymous or you could say, oh, I was joking, and there's this loss of context and this loss of tone that happens with this type of communication. So it's important to keep in mind that while we have censorship as a concern in and of itself, as well as these other things such as many communications, dynamic content, it being large and global, we also have the issue of how do we balance what we value as a society, so in this case freedom of expression, with the context that network communications is just hard to monitor. So in the next video, we're going to talk about breaking trust and what this means in terms of our network communications and in terms of the other things that we're going to be dealing with. And then I'm also going to ask you some questions that you should be asking yourself. You can discuss these in your groups, or you can talk about them in the discussion zone on Teams, and we'll get to those again in the next video.